It's 9:09, and Ben and I are doing something of a tag team this morning. We are taking a little bit of a deviation from this fall's early topic in light of the news that was published on Tuesday in virtually every newspaper around the globe. Now, Ben has introduced it.
Right from the National Enquirer.
Right. The important headlines. I, on the other hand, want to take a very serious approach to this topic this morning. And I'm indebted to Tim Shank, who is the rector of the Church of St. John the Evangelist in Hingham, for this very, very serious approach that I'm going to take this morning. And that is, I'm going to give you the top 10 reasons not to be Jesus's wife. Had you fooled, didn't I, for a second? All right. Number 10. It's hard to take the Lord's name in vain when he's standing in the kitchen. Number 9. When arguing, he always turns the other cheek. It's so aggravating. Number 8, passing the salt at the dinner table gets you a lecture about what happens when salt loses its saltiness. Number 7, 12 guys always hanging around makes intimate moments impossible. Number 6, having to endure people singing "Joy to the world" on his birthday gets very old. Number 5, being called Mrs. Christ is irritating. How many times have I told you that's not our last name? Number 4, there are those awkward encounters with Pilate's wife at the Pilates class. Christine's having heart failure right there. Number 3, your mother-in-law is perfect. Do you have any idea how much pressure that puts on me at Thanksgiving? Number 2, even though it's all innocent, it's tough when your husband is always laying hands on other people. And number 1, it's really tough to live with someone who's nursing a major Messiah complex. Seriously, though.
I hate to see what it was like when you weren't serious.
A writer, I should say, for the Smithsonian Magazine did a long interview with Karen King, the Harvard professor who has written the paper that is responsible for revealing this fragment. What is this fragment? It is 4 centimeters by 8 centimeters in size. In other words, it's the size of an index card. Excuse me, a business card. Okay? There's writing on it front and back. The writing on the front involves 8 or so lines of text which don't have a clear beginning and don't have a clear end. They are words there, but they're part of something else. There's writing on the back which is not very legible. It seems to have been cut from a larger manuscript. Where is the larger manuscript? Nobody knows. King gave this fragment the dubious title of the Gospel of Jesus's Wife. Now, that title, in and of itself, suggests that this fragment has equal weight to the other lengthier texts with which we are familiar. Likewise, the texts with which you are probably not as familiar, those which are called the Gnostic Gospels and are found in other sources. What is interesting is that King says that she uses the word gospel to refer to any, mind you, any early writing describing the life or afterlife of Jesus. We're not in Kansas anymore. Because that's her premise, but that's not how the rest of us use the word gospel, which is one of the reasons why it's been a week of what on earth is going on. King said that she also infers from a variety of clues and comparisons, but I do not have the specifics on those, that in line 3 of this fragment there is a reference to Mary. And she infers that that's probably Mary Magdalene. And in line 4, there's a reference to wife. And in line 5, there's the reference to she. And King infers that both wife and she refer to Magdalene. Again, this is how she is thinking. I suggest to you it's very difficult in a business card size fragment to make such inferences without the rest of whatever this was part of. King sees this fragment as fresh evidence of the diversity of voices in early Christianity. Now, it's important for all of us to remember that there were always a diversity of voices in early Christianity. There were a diversity of voices whether you, even if you wanted to exclude everything that has been called for almost 2,000 years heresy, or everything that comes out of the Gnostic tradition. If you want to exclude all of that, you still have a diversity of voices. Why do I say that? Read the New Testament. Not every writer of the New Testament sounds exactly the same, and yet the church, in its early years, managed to be able to say that those voices, those 27 voices that we call the New Testament, did indeed tell the good news of God in Jesus Christ, which is what the word gospel means, coming from the Old English word Godspell. Now, in the Gospels, I should say, that we know, there is no mention of Jesus being married. And Lord knows there was ample opportunity. In Mark, Mark speaks of Jesus coming, I think he's in Galilee. It doesn't matter where he is. But he's in a village. And they say, you know, your mother and your sisters and your brothers are outside. And he says, those who follow me are my mother, my sisters, and my brothers. Ample opportunity for Mark to have said, you know, your wife is outside. Didn't say that. Matthew, the same way. There's a passage where they say, isn't this the carpenter's son? And isn't Mary his mother? And don't we know his brother Joseph and his brother Simon? And don't we know all of his sisters? Ample opportunity to have said, and don't we know his wife? But that wasn't there. So, was Jesus celibate, as many have said for 2,000 years? Or is King onto something? Well, part of trying to understand this, I think, is that we have to go back in time to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And you know how Ben frequently says in a sermon, that we've got to let Jesus be a first century Jew. Well, we've got to let our writers be second and third century people and see what they may have said. In the late part of the second century, one of the church fathers was a man named Clement of Alexandria. And he reported on a group of second century Christians saying the following: these Christians who say outright that marriage is fornication and teach that it was introduced by the devil, they proudly say that they are imitating the Lord, who neither married nor had any possessions in this world, boasting that they understand the gospel better than anyone else. Now, Clement's position was that while celibacy and virginity were good for God's elect, that is, Christians, it was also possible for good Christians to have sexual intercourse in marriage, so long as it was without desire and only for procreation. Why am I telling you all this? Because part of what we have to do is understand the world in which this fragment may have emerged. And Clement has already identified some people who have problems with marriage, and they're going to imitate Jesus. Likewise, this is the period, this is bordering on the period of time when the whole idea of Mary Magdalene as a prostitute emerged. Small bits and pieces, either within or perhaps on the fringe of Christian communities in the early days of the church. We also have to consider some of this because some of these writings are the foundation of celibacy within the priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church. Another early church father named Tertullian, and both he and Clement lived at the turn of the second century into the third century. Tertullian used Jesus's unmarried state to support the idea of celibacy among those who would serve the church. He said that celibacy was how holy men turned away from the world and turned their focus, their life, towards God. That would begin to change about 100 years later when St. John Chrysostom lived at the end of the 3rd century. And Chrysostom used marriage as an image for baptism. That what happens in baptism is as intimate a relationship as one has in marriage. That when you go into the waters, into the death of Jesus, and you rise up, that's as intimate as any marital relationship. And so Chrysostom used bridal imagery frequently in talking about people coming into the church. Again, if this fragment, as King says, the fragment she dates to the early part of the 4th century. But she believes that the fragment is based on 2nd century texts. Well, these are some of the ideas that are shifting around in the Christian community at the time of either what King says is when the text originated or when the fragment actually originated. King also has said that she sees this fragment, the gospel of Jesus' wife, as something of a marriage certificate. She believes that it puts into greater question the assumption that Jesus wasn't married, which King says has no evidence. She says the fragment also casts doubt on, quote, the whole Catholic claim of celibate priesthood based on Jesus's celibacy. And she says it raises issues with Rome's position that celibacy is the tradition. King believes that the fragment is an alternative tradition of the early church that was silenced by the organized church. Now, part of trying to understand what King is doing, we have to dig into how does King approach Christian history. She says that she approaches Christian history to try to integrate a whole set of heretical literature into the standard history. And by the way, heretical for her is in quotes because she says that she does not accept the term heretical. No early literature, Christian literature, is heretical in her mind. I happen to thoroughly disagree with her, but it's not about me. She was asked in this interview with the Smithsonian Magazine what was her goal as a historian, and she said, "I am less interested in proselytizing or in a bigger tent for its own sake than I am interested in issues of human flourishing. What are the best conditions in which people live and flourish? What does it mean? What does this ancient history mean for living now?" She says, what history can do is show that people have to take responsibility for what they activate out of their own tradition. It's not just a given thing that one follows slavishly. You have to be accountable. She says that the gospel of Jesus' wife will be big for different groups in different ways. It'll start a conversation. And my thought is that that will be the longest real impact. Well, I got to tell you, I don't know what your Facebook page has been like, but she started a conversation because I've seen something at least twice a day from colleagues of mine about the gospel of Jesus' wife. But I haven't seen anything, in my opinion, that proves that this fragment, the size of a business card, presents something that changes the whole picture. It's caused me to go back and look at stuff that I haven't looked at since fall of my second year in seminary, and that would be fall 1983. I haven't dug into Chrysostom and Tertullian and Clement. Not because they're not important, I just haven't had occasion to. But now I'm going back to see, wait a minute, how do I defend what I believe in the face of the sensationalizing that we've seen this week of this business card? And part of how I do that is try to say, it's not new idea that there were diverse voices. There always were diverse voices. The imagery of a wife, of a bride, was not unheard of in the early church. It existed among church fathers that we have studied and dug through for 2,000 years. Why did it exist? Because it was there to suggest what our relationship is meant to be with God and with Jesus Christ, that it's meant to be that intimate a relationship. The issue of Jesus being married or not married, there were lots of opportunities for the New Testament writers to have addressed that, if he was. Lots of them. Paul could have cited him as an example to the Corinthians, all through the first letter of the Corinthians, when he was writing to them because they were being bad boys and girls. He could have used that as an example. It never came up. And so, that brings us to, so how should faithful Christians respond to something like this? And that's my segue.
Anyone read Dan Brown's book?
Yeah.
You know, I never read it. I've heard that it's a good book.
The book was better than the movie.
Okay, well, that's usually the case. And Dan Brown, of course, writing a book called The Da Vinci Code. And the problem with that is it's not so much that he wrote it, it's fiction, but he begins the book by saying that all references to documents and stuff like that are historical. They are not. They are not. And if you're interested, I can point you to books. There's something strange going on in our culture. And it's postmodernism, that's what it is. And I see it in things like, I remember Oliver Stone's JFK? Okay? I saw that, and not the day after it was released, people were going, oh, that's what really happened to JFK. And how, what Oliver Stone did is he wove every conceivable conspiracy theory that was out there into a movie, and then people go to see it, and they're like, oh, that must have been the way it really happened. That people don't seem to have the capacity to determine when they're having the wool pulled over them. And that I'm not quite sure what to do about. Take King's comment about gospel. In the postmodern world, here's the thing. A text's validity has no bearing on its history. In the postmodern world, what makes a text valid is whether it speaks to me. Now, you can agree or disagree with that from now until the cows come home. That's what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. It's basically making an argument with facts that are not in evidence and treating it as if this is fact. King is saying there were documents out there. There were documents out there that said Jesus was married and they were suppressed. Well, we don't have evidence of that. We have documents from 100 years later after Jesus' death. But we don't have anything remotely holding a candle to the four Gospels that we have in terms of textual criticism. And I'd point you to F.F. Bruce's handout, which I gave you. The purpose of that handout was to show you how it is that whatever document we're talking about, whether it's the Gospel or whether it's Thucydides or some other ancient text, what scholars look at is they want to look at, here's this fragment, here's this piece of information, when do we think we can date it? And then we look at other pieces, and we can go all the way back to fragments of the New Testament that are dated within the lifetime of the memories of the people who were with him. Now, we don't have a complete New Testament going all the way back then, but as you start building it all up, you can see right away through all the documents that there's nothing in there about Jesus being married. Now, does it matter? Well, this is where I'm going with my point. If we assume that King is right and that Jesus is married, that raises a lot of questions about what happened to her. We don't know that she died. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. What if she didn't? And what if she was left with nothing? Now, as a theologian, I think that calls into question the love of God. How can you talk about someone giving themselves for the world, self-giving, pouring out love that comes at the expense of the woman he's supposed to have given his life to in marriage. Again, I'm making an argument just based on King. I mean, I think this argument is pointless, okay? But the problem is that people hear all this stuff and they're like, wow, that really speaks to me. And okay, I have a Facebook friend who is a Christian who always quotes Buddha and Buddhism. Now, there's not a problem with that. I mean, it's not like it's wrong. But it just strikes me as odd that there's never a quote from Scripture. And the message is, the Scripture doesn't speak to me. And oh, okay, why be Christian? Why not be a Buddhist? Okay, read Buddha. I don't think that's a problem. You want to read the Quran? Read the Quran. You want to read the Gnostic Gospels? I've got them all. I've got the Nag Hammadi text, I've got the Dead Sea Scrolls, I've got all of the other Gnostic Gospels in my library. You're welcome to copy them. Read it. What you're going to find is that there is a huge difference in, say, the Gospel of Thomas than you find in the four Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas is simply a collection of sayings that have no plot. There's no story in the Gospel of Thomas at all. It's just a bunch of collections of sayings. Does that mean you shouldn't read it? No. Does that mean that there isn't any truth in it that you could glean out of? No. Well, maybe there is some information in there. I think the value of those kind of documents is that it gives us a window, and the value of this fragment, if we assume that King is right, it gives us an insight into the minds of second century people. But that's all it does. Now, to give credit where credit's due, King says, the media didn't seem to focus on this, King says this fragment does not prove that Jesus was married. So my concern and my struggle is, how do I help people? How do I help you discern what's out there when we live in this world where truth is whatever speaks to me? And the only thing I know to do is to say, okay, well, on the one hand, if something like that speaks to you, fine, but you might want to know why scholars look at documents in a certain way and make a judgment about their reliability. And now I'm back to this handout that I gave you. There is a mountain of evidence of the Gospels and the New Testament that we have. A mountain of evidence. All of it corroborating. Rather than the church, and here's another thing about history, but it's hard to convey in a short period of time. Did Constantine pick the Bible? No, he did not. He did not. Were there politics involved? Yes. Were there power plays involved? Yes. Were all the councils pure and holy? No. Not by any stretch of the imagination. But the thing is that the documents that are our New Testament were already out there. And other fathers of the church had talked about them. And they said nothing. And here's an interesting one. Marcion. We've talked about Marcion. You know, remember Marcion? What did he do? He was way ahead of his time. He was a postmodern in the second century. Marcion took the documents that were out there that were not yet compiled into the New Testament and said the only ones that really are Scripture are Luke, parts of Luke, and most of Paul's letters. And you know what's missing? And this is a Gnostic guy, by the way. He doesn't say anything about the Gospel of Thomas or any of these other hidden Gospels. Here's a guy who is no friend of orthodoxy. He is got this idea in his head about who God is, and so he wants to pull together whatever is going to support his point of view, and he doesn't even consider these other documents. How do you explain that? If it was this big, big, big conspiracy, because Marcion's way before, the Council of Nicaea. So, it's just for me, it's a confusing time to live in, right? Because we live in this world where someone can call anything that speaks to them a gospel. And for the average person on the street, that sounds like it's the same thing as the four Gospels. And the really fascinating thing for me is that what's going on now with all this kind of stuff is what was going on in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries with the average person on the street. Remember homoousius and homoiousius? Okay? The scholars are arguing with each other whether Jesus is of the same substance as the Father or of like substance as the Father, and the people like you out there are like, it doesn't make an iota bit of difference, because all we're talking about is one letter. They didn't understand it. It didn't make sense to them. And you get someone who shows up with a really clever way of talking and has got all the credentials, and people are buying it hook, line, and sinker. All I can do is say to you, do some reading. Read F.F. Bruce's Are the New Testament Documents Reliable? Read, the stuff that's out there read Bart Ehrman, for example. Bart Ehrman is a scholar who has written extensively about the Gnostic Gospels. And if you read him and then read, say, N.T. Wright on the Gospel of Judas or these other Gnostic Gospels, you'll probably pick up right away that they are not on the same page. Here are two scholars, where one is taking all of his credentials and basically making the argument that all these other documents are out there and they've been hidden from us. And he's very subtle about the way he goes about it. He's very subtle. N.T. Wright is not so subtle. He basically saying that these scholars are irresponsible. So, I'm sorry, but I don't think it's right to for a scholar to come out and say that Jesus was married and there were all these documents and they're from that period of time, and no one can pull out anything that says that. No one can pull out a document and say, here is evidence that it comes from 70 or prior to 70 AD. The earliest fragments that we have point to a time no earlier than the late 2nd century, a full 100 years after Jesus was dead. So there you go. I mean, I'm just trying to help you try to sort some of